I don't think I'm being all that controversial when I say the world has felt a bit unstable in recent years. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we observed that the many interconnected systems we really rely upon to keep modern civilization up and running are maybe a little more fragile than they at first seemed. In addition to the scores of deaths that tragically occurred from COVID itself, we saw runs on supplies that left many store shelves bare of many essentials, a sharp spike in unemployment, and finally, persistent inflation that really put the squeeze on consumers. Even now, 5 years after all that hell really broke loose, it doesn't feel like conditions have returned to what we once called normal. Avian flu is now tearing through poultry flocks, driving egg prices to extreme highs, and looming trade wars are threatening to drive up the cost of pretty much everything else we need to run our lives. In spite of pointing all of this out, though, I'm not actually trying to be an alarmist doomsayer here, and I don't expect some kind of big cinematic apocalypse to occur anytime soon. This is really just my long-winded way of acknowledging that our current times feel uncertain, and during uncertain times, interest in activities such as gardening tend to spike as people feel a need to be more self-sufficient and have a desire to produce at least some of their own food. And this begs the question, is self-sufficiency, especially when you don't have substantial acreage at your disposal, even a possibility? So that's the topic that I'm going to explore here in this video. And admittedly, a bunch of what's to follow is anecdotal and based on my own experience growing food on a small lot within city limits over the last few years. And so you don't have to look at me sitting here babbling for the next however many minutes this video ends up being. I'm going to voice over some B-roll of me working on a few garden projects that I have going. The short answer to the overarching question, can a small to medium scale backyard gardener achieve self-sufficiency and food security, is a resounding probably not. Over the past few seasons, I've tracked and logged the approximate number of calories I've grown on my 400 square feet of growable space, and the numbers are not encouraging from a strictly survivalist perspective. All the produce I grow in a year, in addition to the eggs from our 3 hens, is the equivalent of about 2 to 3 weeks of caloric needs for my family of 3. And the effort needed to produce even that is substantial. It takes up almost all of my free time, and between the gardening itself and all the canning and preserving required as the harvest rolls in, I'm effectively working a second full-time job during the spring and summer. So I think it's safe to say that it isn't humanly possible for one guy on a postage stamp urban lot to somehow eke out a whole year's worth of caloric and nutritional needs from a handful of raised bed gardens. Sure, if I decided to devote all of my grow space to more calorically dense veggies, such as winter squash, potatoes, and sweet potatoes, I might milk a few more weeks of subsistence out of my soil, but in the unlikely nightmare scenario where we could only eat what we grew, we would ultimately starve. So, now, if full self-sufficiency from a small property is a pipe dream, does it mean keeping a garden during hard times is a futile endeavor, a waste of precious time and energy? Far from it. A small to medium garden space won't provide all of the calories a typical family needs to survive, but it can inoculate against inflation and supply chain disruptions. For example, if fuel and fertilizer prices skyrocket, causing a drastic increase in the cost to grow and ship commercial produce, it's not completely implausible that fresh produce at the grocery store could become more or less unaffordable to the average consumer. Drought, wildfires, and other natural disasters could similarly negatively affect both price and availability of foodstuffs. What if the only items at the supermarket I could reasonably afford, or were even available, were bulk bags of stuff like dried beans and rice and maybe a few dented cans of God knows what from the discount bin? If such conditions were to become the norm, I would be very happy to have a garden full of fresh produce, a pantry full of home-canned veggies, and a handful of fresh eggs a week to turn the aforementioned rice and beans into flavorful and nutritious meals, while also taking just a little pressure off the bank account. And if nothing else, gardening is, at least for me, a huge emotional boost, a natural antidepressant. This fact alone could make a garden priceless during hard times of both a personal and societal nature. And if you really think about it, the very concept of a fully self-sufficient individual or a nuclear family unit thriving against all odds in a hostile world is kind of a B-grade movie ridiculousness. Now, even if you could meet all of your food needs on your own little plot of land, do you have all of the other many necessary skills and resources required to lead a happy and healthy life? Can you effectively treat serious illness and injury in both humans and animals? Can you fix a major infrastructural issue with your home or vehicle? Can you produce or procure all the parts needed to even do so? And while there may very well be a handful of superhumans out there who do, in fact, possess every specialized skill known to man and are sitting on a lifetime supply of brake pads and roofing shingles, I'm guessing most of us mere mortals are good at a few things, mediocre at a few more, and completely lost when it comes to everything else. Humans formed civilization for a reason, and even before there was civilization, humans and proto-humans weren't exactly roaming solo around the savannas and forests, punching out lions and cave bears. Community has kept us alive from the get-go. A reasonably large collective of individuals, each bringing their own strengths and skills to the table, will always be far stronger than a lone prepper on a few acres of land. And this is where I think the backyard garden is most useful, as part of a collective effort to improve food security and nutrition on the community level. If every suburban lawn had a vegetable plot, every vacant urban lot was turned into a community garden, and every apartment, patio, or balcony had a container or two of something edible, would a sort of community sufficiency result? The answer is yes, and we have historical proof in the form of victory gardens. First conceived during World War I and initially referred to as the way more badass sounding war garden, the idea was that if enough citizens grew at least some of their own vegetables, the collective effort would free up food resources and manpower needed for the war effort. In the United States, war gardens provided an estimated 1.42 million quarts of canned fruits and vegetables by the end of the war. That's certainly nothing to scoff at. Victory garden programs were revived during the Second World War, and they had an even greater effect. By war's end, around 20 million victory gardens produced approximately 8 million tons of food, which was roughly 40% of all fresh fruits and vegetables consumed in the United States at the time. I'm inclined to wonder what would happen if us regular folk implemented our own sort of victory garden plan, not in response to a foreign war, but as a proactive countermeasure to inflation and economic uncertainty. On the local level, a collaboration of enough small-scale gardeners could help harden a community against food insecurity and poor nutrition, especially if they were willing to give away a portion of any surplus to those who aren't in a position to keep a garden of their own. Beyond that, on a regional or national level, I'm inclined to wonder what would happen if a modern victory garden project produced that 40% number my grandparents' generation hit during World War II. Millions of tons of homegrown produce would be a fairly significant increase in a nation's food supply. And while there's a lot I don't know about economics, one of the few things I remember from that Econ 101 course I was forced to take in college is that, generally speaking, as supply increases, prices decrease. Naturally, there are some obstacles in the way of a new victory garden movement, most notably issues of space and time. With home prices at historical highs, it's harder than ever for first-time buyers to afford even a modest starter home, and it's unlikely many landlords would be willing to sign off on a tenant tearing up the yard of a rental property to install vegetable gardens. Stating the obvious, you can't grow your own food if you can't access a place to do so. Additionally, time is a factor. As I noted at the beginning of this video, gardening, especially if the end goal is to grow and preserve a surplus of food, can be a lot of hard, time-consuming work. People are arguably busier than ever these days. Most households require 2 or more people working full-time to maintain even a modest standard of living, or, even just to take care of the basics of life. Situations in which one working-age adult gets to stay home and focus on household duties are now the exception rather than the rule. It's understandable that if, after a week of working a full-time job, or multiple part-time jobs, or a full-time job plus a part-time job, and also dealing with all of the many other tedious, stressful, and draining life maintenance tasks required to keep it all from falling apart, someone just doesn't have it in them to devote their scarce free time to an activity that's mostly manual labor. So what's the solution here? Well, damned if I know. These are heavy, complex societal issues, and at the end of the day, I'm just some dumbass who's sort of decent at growing tomatoes. Lobbying municipalities to allocate vacant land to vegetable gardening might have some potential, though I imagine there are more than a few hurdles to clear in order to get that sort of a program off the ground. It should be noted that container gardening on patios and balconies is a worthwhile endeavor for those with limited space. No, a few potted tomatoes on an apartment balcony won't feed you through a zombie apocalypse, but those tomatoes will taste orders of magnitude better than anything you can buy at the store. And even the smallest of container gardens can be part of a greater victory garden style movement. If anyone happens to stumble across this video and is looking to start a garden as part of a tough times preparedness plan, and has the time and space to do so, I do have a few general tips for this. First, don't assume raised beds are your best option. While my gardens are pretty much all raised beds, this was due to there being tremendously poor clay soil under our property. While clay can be amended into something arable, that process often takes years, and I'm a very impatient person. Between the beds themselves and decent soil with which to fill them, raised beds drastically increase the cost of starting a garden. If you look at a garden as an investment, a raised bed setup will increase the amount of time it takes to see a return. While most of my setup was funded by unexpected windfalls like tax refunds, COVID stimulus payments, and the occasional work bonus, and my garden projects never encroached on the mortgage payment, I still would have loved to have been able to go with a good old-fashioned in-ground garden. Second, learn to preserve and can your surplus. Even a modest-sized garden can yield more produce than an individual or family can eat fresh. Why let it all go to waste? While the process of canning produce is tedious, and I personally hate doing it, it's actually not as hard as it all looks. Even pressure canning, as intimidating as it seems, is really just a matter of following instructions and recipes right to the letter. Having a pantry full of home canned sauces, salsas, and other staples is a great feeling when prices start to rise and items become scarce on store shelves. Drying and freezing are also great ways to preserve a harvest, and those are maybe a little less labor intensive than canning. Finally, accept that there's a learning curve to gardening, and your first season or two is probably going to suck. While you can reduce this learning curve a little by perusing the wealth of gardening knowledge that's now available with a few clicks or taps, each garden is, in a way, its own little universe with its own unique challenges and idiosyncrasies. What works in a garden a few doors away might fall flat in yours. It's likely going to take a season or two to get into a good flow in your garden and get it to really start producing. Don't give up if you don't have immediate success. And that's really all I have on the subject of gardening through hard times. Yeah, it was a little bit of a darker theme than my usual gardening how-tos and tours, so I don't plan on making a habit of it. My next video is just going to be on the best winter squash varieties for small spaces and hot climates, so more of a business as usual kind of deal. And until then, let's hope it all doesn't die.